She had 72 hours before the bank took everything her father had built. The flour was nearly gone, the oven barely held heat, and the last candle burned low on the counter of a bakery that smelled like failure. Clara Whitlock was 24 years old and already watching her life collapse into ash. Then the door swung open before sunrise, and a stranger walked in from the cold. Boots caked in mud, jaw set hard, eyes that had seen too much of the wrong kind of country. He looked at the bread on the shelf. He looked at her, and he said, "I'll take all of it." That was the moment everything changed. Like, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow had been coming down for 3 days straight, and Durango wasn't the kind of town that apologized for its weather. It sat hard and low against the San Juan Mountains, a place carved out of rock and necessity, built by men who needed coal and copper more than they needed comfort. The main street ran muddy and uneven beneath a thick coat of white, and the buildings that lined it, the saloon, the assayer's office, the general store, the livery, all leaned slightly as if the whole town was bracing against the same invisible wind. Durango had been incorporated only a year before, in 1882, and it wore its newness like a bruise. Half the storefronts still had raw lumber you could smell in wet weather. Half the residents still slept in tents on the eastern flats. But Whitlock's bakery had been there since the beginning. That was the one thing Clara held on to when everything else started slipping. Her father, George Whitlock, had arrived with the first wave of settlers and had the foresight to build an oven before he built a bed. "A mining town runs on bread and whiskey," he used to say, loading the oven at 4 a.m. while the sky outside was still dead black. "And I don't have the stomach for whiskey business." He'd laughed at his own joke every single time he told it, and Clara had heard it so many times that she knew exactly when to smile, exactly when to shake her head, exactly when to say, "Papa, please." She missed that joke now with an ache that surprised her, even after 8 months. George Whitlock had died of a burst appendix in March, on a Tuesday, with no warning and no goodbye. Clara had been 23 years old and covered in flour when the doctor found her in the back room and told her. She'd stood very still for a long time. Then she'd finished the loaves she was working on, because they were halfway done and waste was waste. She'd been running the bakery alone ever since. The problem wasn't the work. Clara had grown up working beside her father from the time she was tall enough to reach the kneading table. She knew the rhythms of the oven, knew how the dough changed in cold weather, knew which customers wanted their crust soft, and which ones wanted it cracked hard enough to knock on. She wasn't afraid of early mornings or late nights or flour-dusted hands. She was good at the work. She was actually better at it than her father had been, though she would never have said that out loud while he was alive. The problem was everything else. George Whitlock had been a man who kept his finances in his head and his paperwork in a battered tin box under the counter. And when Clara finally opened that box and spread its contents across the flour-dusted work table, she understood that her father had been drowning quietly for years. There were notes from the First Bank of Durango. 3 of them, each one a reminder of the loan George had taken out when he built the second oven. And the interest had been growing like something alive and hungry. There was a letter from the lumber company about the still unpaid bill for the shelving he'd installed the previous autumn. There was a receipt from the grain supplier in Pueblo, the one Clara had been trying to pay down $5 at a time. In total, the bakery owed $237 across 4 different creditors. That might not have sounded like ruin to a rancher or a mine owner, but to a bakery that cleared maybe $8 to $12 in a good week, it was a mountain that was very slowly falling on her. She'd spent the first 2 months after her father's death trying to manage it herself, cutting costs, working longer hours, experimenting with new items, sweet rolls, meat pies, corn dodgers, anything to pull in customers who might not have come in before. Some of it worked. The meat pies sold well on Fridays when the miners got paid. The sweet rolls disappeared fast when she put them in the window. But the debt kept growing faster than the sales, and by October she'd had to let go of the one girl she'd hired to help on mornings, a quiet 15-year-old named Polly who had cried when Clara told her, which had made Clara feel like the worst person in the territorial limits of Colorado. By December, she was doing everything alone. She rose before 4 every morning, started the fire in the ovens, mixed the dough in the cold dark while her breath fogged the air, worked until the first loaves came out, then kept working until the last customer left in the late afternoon. Then she cleaned and prepped for the next day and went to bed in the small room at the back of the building, which was also the room where she ate dinner and kept her clothes, and once a week, when she could heat enough water, where she bathed. She was tired in a way that lived in her bones. It was the 3rd of December when Harlan Price came in with the letter. Harlan worked at the bank. He wasn't the manager, just a clerk, but he seemed to take some private satisfaction in delivering bad news personally, because he'd been in twice before with similar envelopes. He was a small man with large teeth and a habit of touching the brim of his hat too often. "Miss Whitlock," he said, setting the envelope on the counter beside a row of rye loaves. "Mr. Price." She didn't stop wiping the counter. "That's from Mr. Aldrich, the bank manager. He asked me to make sure you received it personally." "I can see that." She put down the rag and opened the envelope. She read it twice, not because the language was complicated, but because some part of her had hoped she'd misread it the first time. She hadn't. The bank was calling in the principal on the primary loan, full repayment, $80, due by January 5th. That was 33 days away. There's also the matter of the December payment that was past due as of last. "I know about the December payment," Clara said. "Mr. Aldrich wanted me to emphasize that the January 5th date is firm." "You've emphasized it." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. "Is there anything you'd like to buy?" Harlan looked at the rye loaves. He bought one, probably out of some dim sense of guilt, and left without meeting her eyes again. Clara stood at the counter for a long moment after the door closed. $80 by January 5th, plus the December payment, which was another $4, plus the lumber bill, which the supplier had stopped being patient about, plus the grain order she had to place before the week was out if she wanted to keep the ovens running. She did the arithmetic in her head the way her father had taught her, clearly and without mercy. She could not do it. Even if December trading was better than November, and it usually was, slightly, because people bought more bread around Christmas, she could not earn $84 in 33 days on top of covering her supply costs. It was not possible. She thought about selling the second oven. She thought about it for about 3 minutes before she accepted that, without it, she couldn't produce enough volume to generate any real income, which meant selling the oven would be a slower death, not a solution. She thought about writing to her mother's sister in Ohio, a woman she'd met twice and who had sent a 1-paragraph letter of condolence after George died. She thought about that for approximately 30 seconds before deciding she would burn the bakery down herself before she asked that woman for money. She thought about going to see Mr. Aldrich directly, explaining the situation, asking for more time. She had actually tried that in October, and Aldrich had listened with the careful, sympathetic expression of a man who had already made up his mind and was only waiting for her to finish talking. So Clara did what she did when there was no good answer. She went to the back room, put on her apron, and started a second batch of dough. It was the 6th of December, a Wednesday, when the weather turned genuinely vicious. The temperature dropped hard overnight, and by the time Clara had the ovens going at 4:30 in the morning, the wind was cutting under the door and raising a thin ribbon of frozen air along the floor. She'd stuffed an old flour sack against the gap, but it didn't do much. She worked in her coat and her father's old wool scarf, and tried not to think about the fact that the woodpile out back was lower than it should be. She was shaping the second set of loaves, sourdough, the one she made from the starter her father had kept alive for 11 years, when she heard the horse. Not unusual, of course. Horses moved through Durango at all hours. The livery was only 2 blocks away, and the road past the bakery connected the main street to the eastern residential lots, where some of the mine supervisors had built proper houses. But this horse stopped directly outside. Clara kept shaping the dough. She heard boots on the step. The door opened. The man who came in was tall, which was the first thing she registered because the door frame was lower than average, and he ducked through it without looking down, the automatic adjustment of someone who'd learned early to watch for that. He wore a heavy canvas duster coated in trail dust that the snow had turned to gray mud at the hem. His hat was pushed back slightly, dark felt, water-stained along the band. He was maybe 30, maybe a few years older. It was hard to say, because he had one of those faces that the frontier aged selectively, creased around the eyes and jaw, but still carrying something younger underneath. He looked at the loaves on the shelf. He looked at the loaves she was shaping. Then he looked at her. "You open?" "I'm baking," Clara said. "Come back at 6. "I saw the light." He nodded at the window. The light's because I'm working, not because I'm selling. He seemed to consider that. Then he walked to the counter anyway and looked more carefully at the loaves on the shelf, the sourdough from yesterday, the 2 remaining rye loaves from the morning batch, the small corn loaves she'd baked late the previous afternoon that hadn't sold. How many you got finished? Enough for my morning customers. I'll buy them all. He said it without any particular drama, the way you'd say I'll take the brown one. Whatever you've got ready right now, all of it. Clara stopped shaping the loaf in her hands. That's 7 loaves. Fine. It's 4 in the morning. I can see that. She looked at him. He was looking at the bread, not at her, which she found slightly irritating. She wasn't sure what she expected, but she'd expected him to at least try to explain himself. Men usually explained themselves, especially when they were doing something strange. That'll be $1.40, she said. He reached into his coat and put $2 on the counter without being asked. Keep the change. Clara picked up the coins and looked at them, which she knew was a graceless thing to do, but she looked at them anyway. 2 real silver dollars, not scrip, not a promissory note. She hadn't seen actual silver dollars in almost 2 weeks. You riding through? She asked. No. He started stacking the loaves carefully, tucking them inside a canvas bag he'd pulled from somewhere under the duster. I'm working the Mercer place, east of town. I don't know the Mercer place. It's new. My uncle bought the land in September. He looked up briefly. Rhett Mercer. He said his name like it was information she might need later, not like he expected her to know it. Clara Whitlock, she said, because it seemed like the thing to say. He nodded, finished loading the bread, and moved toward the door. Your sourdough, he said, not looking back. It's good. My mother made it similar. Not many people still do the real starter. Then he was gone. The door closed. She heard the horse move off into the dark. Clara stood in the middle of the bakery for a long moment, holding a $2 coin in each hand, listening to the wind under the door and the low work of the ovens. Then she went back to the dough. She didn't expect him to return. That sounds worse than she meant it. She didn't think about him returning or not returning. She thought about dough hydration and oven temperature, and whether she could stretch the current flour supply 3 more days if she reduced the batch sizes slightly. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket. She thought about $80 in 33 days, and whether there was any calculation she hadn't tried. But she did notice, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the 2 silver dollars had bought her enough corn flour for another 4 days and left enough over to pay down $2 of the lumber bill, which was $2 less of the weight that sat on her chest every morning when she woke up. He came back the following Saturday. It was late afternoon and the bakery was almost empty. She had 3 corn loaves left and 1 dense wheat that hadn't moved because she'd let the crust go a little too hard, and she knew it. She was sweeping the floor when the door opened and he came in, again in the canvas duster, again with the hat pushed back, again looking at the bread before he looked at her. What's left? He asked. 4 loaves. The wheat's a little overcooked. I'll take all 4. He put the money on the counter before she'd said the price. Clara stopped sweeping. You don't have to buy the bread just because it's here. I'm not. He picked up the wheat loaf and looked at the bottom. This isn't overcooked. The bottom's just darker because your oven runs hot in the back corner. She stared at him. How do you know that? I've been baking bread since I was 8 years old. He said it without embarrassment, which surprised her. Men in Durango didn't generally volunteer that kind of information. My father died when I was young. There were 4 of us and my mother worked, so I learned to cook. Clara set down the broom. She wasn't sure what to do with that. With the frankness of it, the plain way he'd said it. No performance of modesty or apology. She taught you the sourdough starter? Clara asked. She taught me everything. I just kept it going. I've been keeping my father's starter going for 8 months. She heard herself saying it and wasn't sure why. It wasn't the kind of thing she usually told strangers. Rhett Mercer looked at her for a moment. Actually looked at her, not at the bread. That's 11 years old, that starter. You remember. I pay attention. He picked up the canvas bag with the loaves. At the door he paused. You take orders? Standing orders? Weekly delivery? Depends on the order. My uncle's running a full crew at the ranch now. 15 men, sometimes more. They go through 6 to 8 loaves a day. He's been buying from the store at the general supply, but it's not... He seemed to choose the word carefully. It's not what it should be. Clara calculated without showing it. 6 to 8 loaves a day, 7 days a week, at 12 cents a loaf. That was $5, maybe $6 a week, if the order was consistent, if it ran through winter. I'd need to know the order in advance, she said. At least 2 days. I can't just... 2 days is fine. I'll come in Monday and we can settle the terms. He left. Clara stood in the empty bakery in the late December light and did the arithmetic again, this time with a number in it that hadn't been there before. $6 a week for 4 weeks was $24. For 8 weeks, $48. It wasn't $80. But it was something real to take to Aldrich at the bank. Something she could point to and say here, this is what's coming. She swept the rest of the floor and tried not to let herself feel too much about it, because she'd learned in the 8 months since her father died that hope was a thing you had to ration carefully. Too much of it in the wrong direction, and it could hurt worse than just the original loss. So, Monday morning, she was up at her usual 4 o'clock, and by the time she'd gotten the first batch in the ovens, she'd already half convinced herself that Rhett Mercer wasn't going to come. Men made suggestions like that all the time. Come find me, I know a man, we should talk. And then they didn't follow through, and if you'd already started planning around the suggestion, you had nobody to blame but yourself. He came in at 10 o'clock, when the morning rush had thinned out, and she was reorganizing the shelf. He sat down on the stool beside the counter, uninvited, but also without any self-consciousness about it, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote down what the ranch needs, he said, and what my uncle's willing to pay. Clara took the paper. The handwriting was clear and careful, which also surprised her. The order was larger than he'd described. Not 6 to 8 loaves a day, 8 to 10, with extra on Fridays for the weekend when some of the crew's families came out, plus twice a month a special order for the main house, rolls, sweetbread, something finer than workman's food. This is more than you said Saturday. I talked to my uncle after. He wants to do it right. He paused. He's particular about food. His wife was French. She died 3 years ago. He doesn't say much about it, but I can tell that bad food bothers him in a way that goes deeper than just preference. Clara looked at the paper again. The twice-monthly order for the main house. What do you mean by something finer? I'd need to know what I'm agreeing to. Rolls, probably. Brioche, if you can do it. My aunt used to make it. I don't know if anyone in Durango... I can do brioche. She said it without thinking, and then immediately wondered if she'd oversold herself. She'd made brioche twice from her mother's recipe years ago. She was fairly certain she remembered the proportions. Rhett looked at her. Good. They settled the price. 11 cents per standard loaf, delivered to the ranch 3 times a week, with a premium on the special orders. It came to almost $7 a week when she worked it out, more than she'd estimated. She wrote it down on her own piece of paper, and he signed it. Actually signed it, like a real contract, which she hadn't expected. And then she signed it too, and that was that. I'll need the first delivery Friday, he said. Friday's fine. He stood to go. She noticed he'd drunk the coffee she'd put in front of him without asking, which was a small liberty, but she found she didn't mind it particularly. The bank letter, he said at the door. Clara looked at him sharply. She hadn't said anything about the bank letter. You looked at it 3 times while we were talking, he said, not unkindly. The paper in your apron pocket. She didn't say anything. It's not my business, he said. But this order, if it runs through winter, and I expect it will, it should be enough to make a payment on something significant. It should, Clara said carefully. My uncle pays promptly. First of the week, every week, no excuses. He paused. That's the kind of man he is. I just thought you should know. He left. The door swung shut behind him. Clara unfolded the paper from her apron pocket, the bank letter, and read it again. $80 by January 5th. She was standing in a bakery in the first week of December, and she had a signed contract for $7 a week. She could not cover the full 80 in time, but she could cover enough of it that a conversation with Aldrich might go differently than the last one had. She put the letter back, put on her apron, and started the dough for Friday's delivery. There was a lot of it to do, and she had work to get to. The first delivery almost broke her. Not because of the volume, she'd prepared for the volume, had worked out the timing across 3 days to stagger the batches properly so everything would be fresh on Friday morning. What she hadn't accounted for was the road. Durango to the Mercer Ranch was 4 miles, and in decent weather it was a reasonable cart ride. In December, with the snow that had fallen Tuesday night and frozen into a rutted, treacherous surface by Friday morning, it was 40 minutes of fighting the horse, a borrowed gray mare from the livery named Beans, who had strong opinions about mud, and praying that the wooden crate she'd rigged didn't slide off the back of the rented cart. She arrived at the ranch gate with every loaf intact and her knuckles white from gripping the reins. Rhett was waiting at the gate, and he looked at the cart and then at her and then at the cart again with an expression that was hard to read. "You drove this yourself?" "I don't have anyone to send." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he opened the gate and helped her carry the crates in without being asked, which she appreciated more than she showed. The ranch was larger than she'd imagined. A proper house, 2 long bunk buildings for the crew, a barn, and stock pens, and the bones of something that was still under construction to the west, maybe a second barn or a storage building. It smelled like cattle and wood smoke and the cold, clean pine of new lumber. A few of the ranch hands stopped to watch as she unloaded, not rudely, just with the frank curiosity of men who weren't used to company. The ranch foreman, a stocky, weather-hardened man named Deacon, who looked like he'd been assembled from rocks and old rope, came out of the bunkhouse and looked at the bread and looked at her. "This the baker?" he said to Rhett. "Miss Clara Whitlock," Rhett said. Deacon picked up a loaf, squeezed it in a way that would have been rude if he were in a shop, and broke the end off. He chewed it. He nodded once. "Better than the store," he said, and went back inside. Clara looked at Rhett. "High praise?" "From Deacon. That's a standing ovation." He almost smiled, not quite, but the edges of it were there. She collected the payment on the spot. Rhett counted it out from a leather pouch, exact to the penny, and made the drive back to Durango with the empty crates rattling behind her. She was cold and tired, and her shoulder ached from fighting the cart on the icy road. But she had $7 in her pocket, and the next delivery was Tuesday. She went to see Aldrich at the bank on the following Monday morning. She'd waited until she had the Friday payment in hand, had her numbers organized, had thought through what she wanted to say. She'd also, without entirely meaning to, worn her better dress. The dark gray wool, not the brown cotton she worked in. Not to impress Aldrich exactly, but because she knew what it felt like to walk into a room where someone expected to dismiss you, and she'd rather give him less to work with. Aldrich was a heavy man in his 50s with small hands and a carefully tended mustache. He listened to her explain the contract with the Mercer Ranch with the same careful, sympathetic expression she'd seen before. "That's encouraging, Miss Whitlock," he said when she finished. "Truly, a standing order of that size is a meaningful development. It means I can begin making substantial payments immediately," Clara said. "I'm proposing a payment of $15 on January 5th rather than the full 80, along with a schedule for the remainder over the following 4 months. Aldrich folded his hands on his desk. "The terms of the loan, I understand the terms. I'm asking you to consider a modification." She kept her voice level. "The alternative is that you foreclose on a bakery in the middle of winter and try to sell it to someone. The Mercer Ranch contract doesn't transfer with the property, it transfers with me." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. "I'll need to review it with the board," he said finally. "Of course." She stood, which she'd decided beforehand to do. Stand first, not wait for him to dismiss her. "I'll expect your answer by Wednesday." She walked out into the cold Durango street and stood for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets, breathing the sharp mountain air. She didn't know if it had worked. She thought there was maybe a reasonable chance that it had. Somewhere east of town, 4 miles out, the Mercer Ranch needed bread on Tuesday. She went home and started the dough. Aldrich sent his answer on Tuesday, not Wednesday. Clara was pulling the second batch of the morning out of the oven when the bank clerk, not Harlan this time, a younger boy she didn't recognize, came in with a folded note and left without waiting for a reply. The bank would accept $15 on January 5th, with the remaining $65 spread across 4 monthly payments, provided the Mercer contract remained active, and Clara submitted a copy of the signed agreement to the bank's records by Friday. She read it twice. Then she set it on the shelf above the cooling rack and went back to work. Because there were 18 loaves going to the ranch tomorrow, and she still had the afternoon prep to do. She let herself feel relieved for exactly the length of time it took her to walk from the shelf back to the kneading table. Maybe 4 steps. And then she put it away somewhere practical and kept moving. That was the week the temperature dropped to 12 degrees and stayed there. Working in cold that severe was its own particular misery. The dough behaved differently when the bakery couldn't hold heat properly. It rose slower, went stiff in ways that threw off her timing, and the oven had to run hotter to compensate, which meant watching it more carefully or risk burning the bottoms. She started sleeping with her coat on. The flour sack stuffed against the door gap stopped working entirely, and she eventually nailed a strip of old blanket across the frame, which helped some but made the place look like a ruin from the outside. She didn't care much about that. What she cared about was getting the Tuesday delivery to the ranch on time, and then the Friday delivery, and then the Tuesday after that. The ranch hands had started to notice the bread in a way that went beyond simply eating it. By the second week, 2 of them had figured out that the brioche she included with the main house order sometimes had a small amount left over. She'd made extra in case her proportions were off, and they'd been fine. And those 2 men started appearing at the delivery gate on the morning she came, not obviously waiting, but also not fooling anyone. Deacon had told them, apparently, that hovering around the gate when the baker came was not dignified, and they should stop it, and they'd both agreed and kept doing it anyway. "You know Holt and Briggs are out there again," Rhett said one Tuesday morning in mid-December, taking one of the crates from her at the gate. His breath showed white in the cold. "I know." She handed him the second crate. "I made extra." "You don't have to do that." "I charged you for it." She said it matter-of-factly. "It's in the invoice." He almost laughed. That same almost laugh she'd seen once before. The expression that got most of the way there, and then pulled back like it wasn't sure of its welcome. Fair enough. She'd started to understand a few things about Rhett Mercer in those 2 weeks of deliveries. He was consistent in a way that was unusual in her experience. He was always at the gate when she arrived, always helped carry in without making a production of it, always paid exact and immediate. He didn't talk much, but when he did talk, it was to say something specific and usually useful. He knew the ranch's needs well enough to flag things before they became problems. When the crew was expanding for a week, he told her Monday so she could adjust the batch. When the main house order needed to shift to a different day, he sent word in advance. He was also, she'd noticed, watching the road conditions before she arrived, and occasionally, quietly, doing something about them. She'd seen the evidence twice. A section of the track that had been badly rutted and then wasn't. The gate approach that had been icy and then had sand thrown across it. He'd never mentioned it. She'd never mentioned it either, but she'd noticed. What she'd also noticed, and was trying not to read too much into, was that the conversations at the gate were getting longer. Not dramatically. 5 minutes, where before it had been 2, 10 minutes, where before it had been 5. He'd asked about the starter once, and she'd found herself explaining the whole process. The feeding schedule, how you could tell from the smell when it was ready, how her father had nursed it back from near death in the summer of 1876 when they'd gone 3 days without the right flour. Rhett had listened with the specific attention of someone who actually knew what she was talking about and wanted to know more. It was different from the polite listening she usually got when she talked about baking. Different enough that she'd kept going longer than she'd planned. She'd also told him about the bank agreement, which she hadn't intended to do. It had come out sideways. He'd asked how the arrangement was working out, and she'd said fine. And something in the simplicity of the question had made her add, "I went to the bank. They agreed to a payment schedule." And he'd said, "Good," with the same directness he used for everything. And that had been the end of it, but she'd felt something shift slightly, the way a knot loosens one half turn. She hadn't talked to another person about the bank situation since her father died. She hadn't realized how much weight that particular silence had been adding. The cold broke slightly the week before Christmas, which in Durango meant it went from brutal to merely unpleasant, and the road to the ranch thawed enough that the cart stopped fighting her on the ruts. She used the slightly easier mornings to start experimenting with the special orders. She'd been making the brioche correctly, but safely, holding back from anything ambitious. And she decided that was wrong. She tried a cinnamon honey variation on a Wednesday when she had time, burned the first batch because she'd misjudged the sugar content, fixed it the second time, and brought a small test loaf to the Friday delivery without putting it on the invoice. Rhett found it in the crate. He looked at it, looked at her. "What's this?" "I was trying something. Don't count it." He broke off a piece and ate it, standing at the gate in the cold. She watched him chew, which she realized immediately was a strange and vulnerable position to be in, standing there waiting for someone to judge your baking. "The sugar's a little high," he said. "I know, I overcorrected. But the texture is right." He looked at the piece in his hand. "My aunt used to put orange peel in hers." "I've heard of that. I've never had orange peel out here." "You can get it at the general supply, dried. It's usually in the back with the spices." He handed her back the remaining piece of the loaf. "Ask for Martinez. He knows where everything is." She took the loaf piece. It was oddly comfortable, standing there in the cold talking about dried orange peel, and she recognized that comfort and decided it was something to be careful about. Christmas came and went with no ceremony. Clara worked through it. The holiday actually increased her regular sales because a few of the townspeople who didn't usually buy bread wanted something special for Christmas morning, and she'd made a small batch of sweet rolls with dried fruit that sold out by 9. She ate her Christmas dinner alone at the work table, bread and hard cheese and an apple she'd been saving, and it was fine. It wasn't the worst Christmas she'd had, and it wasn't the best, and she was too tired to feel much about it either way. January 5th arrived, and she walked into the First Bank of Durango with $15 in cash and a copy of the Mercer contract, and set them both on Harlan Price's desk without ceremony. Harlan counted the money, stamped the receipt, and put the contract in a folder. He almost said something sympathetic at the end and then seemed to reconsider. "I'll need the February payment by the 1st, Clara told him, and walked out. The thing nobody in Durango had fully understood yet, and she was only beginning to understand it herself, was how much the ranch contract had changed the bakery's position. It wasn't just the money, though the money mattered enormously. It was the reliability. Before the contract, Clara's income had moved up and down with the week, with whether the mines were paying on time or holding the workers' wages until the end of the month. Some weeks she cleared $12. Some weeks she cleared $6. There was no floor. Now there was a floor, $7 a week, every week, prompt and certain. The rest of the business could fluctuate, and she still had the floor. That changed how she thought about everything, about the supply orders, about whether to try new products, about whether she could afford to fix the window latch that had been broken since October. She fixed the window latch. It seemed like a small thing, but it was the first money she'd spent on the building since her father died that wasn't survival spending, and it felt significant in a way she didn't try to explain to anyone. She also started thinking about the spring. The Mercer contract ran through the end of March by the terms they'd agreed. She'd been assuming she would need to renegotiate it, which she'd been quietly worrying about. What if the ranch decided to hire someone to bake on site by then? Or if Rhett's uncle brought in a supply line from Denver? Or any of the dozen things that could end a business arrangement that felt too good to be reliable? But in the second week of January, Rhett brought it up himself. He'd stayed longer than usual that morning. The temperature had dropped again overnight, and she'd had a small problem with one of the crates, a cracked side that she'd had to tie together with rope. And while they were repacking the loaves into an intact crate from the barn, they'd started talking. It had moved, the way their conversations sometimes did, from the practical matter at hand to something wider. "My uncle's been talking about expanding the crew in spring," Rhett said, transferring loaves carefully. "He's got a bid in on some land to the northeast. If it goes through, he'll be running close to 30 men by May. That's a significant expansion." "It is." He paused. "The bread contract would need to expand with it." Clara kept her hands busy with the crate. "I'd need to know the numbers well in advance. I'd have to hire someone." "Who?" "I had a girl working for me earlier in the year. I let her go in October because I couldn't keep paying her." She heard herself say it plainly, without self-pity. "If I knew I'd have a larger order coming, I could bring her back on proper wages." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "What's her name?" Polly Ennis. She lives with her family on the west side." Clara glanced at him. "Why?" "Just asking." He handed her the last loaf. "My uncle will want to confirm the spring expansion by the end of February. I can have him write up new terms." "That would be useful." They'd finished repacking by then, and there was no real reason to keep standing there, and yet neither of them moved immediately toward the door or toward the cart. The barn was cold but sheltered from the wind, and outside the wind was going hard against the roof. "You grew up here?" Rhett asked. "In Durango." She considered. "We came when I was 9. My father heard about the mines and thought there was an opportunity in the supply trades. He was right about the opportunity mostly. He just miscalculated how long it would take. He built a good oven. He built 2 good ovens. She said it with a small, involuntary smile. He was prouder of the second one than he was of almost anything. He said it was the first thing he'd built from scratch that came out the way he'd planned it. Rhett looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. My father was the same way about a fence he built in New Mexico. It's still standing. I checked when I came through that country 3 years ago. He paused. I don't know why I checked. I just wanted to see it. Clara understood that completely. The pulling need to see evidence that someone had existed and made something that lasted. She understood it the way you understand things that are specific to your own experience, and she was slightly startled to feel that recognition for something Rhett had said. The ranch hands are talking about you, he said, moving toward the barn door. In case you didn't know. What are they saying? Good things. Deacon told 2 of them that the bread situation had improved significantly. He pushed the barn door open. That's how he said it. The bread situation has improved significantly, which from Deacon is essentially a formal commendation. Clara laughed. Genuinely, briefly, the surprised kind that comes out before you decide whether to. She saw Rhett register it, saw something warm flicker across his expression, and then go quiet. She drove the cart back to Durango in the January cold and spent the afternoon calculating what a spring expansion would mean in terms of supplies, labor, timing. She wrote the numbers on a piece of paper and looked at them for a while. Then she went to the west side of town and knocked on the door of the Ennis family house, and when Polly opened the door with flour on her hands, the girl had been helping her mother bake, apparently, Claire explained that she might have work again in spring, depending on some things that weren't certain yet but were looking likely. Polly said she'd wait. She said it like she meant it, like she'd been hoping for it, and Clara walked home in the last of the winter light, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. It was quieter than that, more like solid ground beneath her feet after months of mud. The rest of January ran hard. There was a 3-day storm that buried the road to the ranch and forced her to delay the Tuesday delivery until Thursday, which she'd warned Red about in advance. The delay frustrated her in a way that went beyond professionalism. She'd built her reliability as the central thing she had to offer, and missing a delivery date felt like a crack in that foundation, even though circumstances were plainly beyond her control. When she made the Thursday delivery, she'd added 2 extra loaves at no charge without explaining it, and Deacon had looked at the count and looked at her and said, "Weather happens," which was about as close to grace as she'd heard from him. February brought a brief false thaw, a week in the middle of the month, where the temperature climbed to the low 40s, and Durango became briefly, tentatively, a place that could believe in spring. The mud returned in full force, and the road to the ranch was treacherous in a new way, soft and swallowing rather than icy and rigid. Clara lost a wheel in a deep rut on the second Tuesday delivery of the month, which was one of the more purely miserable experiences she'd had since starting the contract. The wheel hadn't broken, just sunk, and she'd spent 40 minutes in ankle-deep mud trying to lever it free before 2 ranch hands coming in off the northern pasture had ridden past, reversed course, and helped her dig it out. She'd arrived at the ranch with mud to her knees and the crates intact. Rhett had looked at her and looked at the cart. "The South Road's better in thaw," he said. "I don't know the South Road." "I'll show you." He'd ridden alongside her cart on the South Road back toward Durango, which added 20 minutes to the route but avoided the worst of the low ground. He didn't make conversation on the ride, and neither did she, and that was fine. It was useful and companionable without requiring anything, and she appreciated that about him more than she could have explained. Some people's silences were heavy, full of things they were deciding not to say. His were just ordinary. They were the silences of someone who wasn't performing anything. At the fork where the South Road met the main trail into town, he'd pulled up his horse, and she'd pulled up the cart. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me. Use it whenever the ground's soft." He paused, and she had the distinct sense he was about to say something else and was deciding whether to. "My uncle confirmed the spring expansion last week. I was going to send word, but..." He stopped. "I was going to come by the bakery instead. I wanted to tell you in person." Clara looked at him, across the narrow road in the February thaw, the mountains white behind him, the horse breathing steam. She felt that careful instinct again, the one that said, "Don't read into it, don't let yourself." "Thank you," she said again, differently. He nodded, He turned the horse back toward the ranch. She drove the cart into town with the mud drying on her boots, and the spring order sitting in her mind like a door that had just opened a crack, letting in a sliver of light she hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. She hired Polly back the following Monday. Polly Ennis was 16 now, a year older than when Clara had let her go. And in that year, she'd apparently decided to become competent at approximately everything. She showed up the first Monday of March with her sleeves already rolled and her hair already pinned and a look on her face that said she'd been waiting long enough and intended to make up for lost time. "I've been practicing," she told Clara without preamble. "Practicing what?" "Baking. At home. I figured if I was going to come back, I should be better than I was." She looked at the work table. "My mother said I used more flour in 2 months than she'd used in a year." Clara put her to work immediately, which was the kindest thing she could have done, because Polly wasn't wrong. She was better. Not accomplished, not ready to run a kitchen on her own, but better in the specific ways that mattered. She understood the dough now instead of just following instructions about it, and she'd stopped being afraid of the oven. The first morning they worked together, Clara caught herself exhaling slowly, the particular exhale of someone who has been holding tension they didn't know they were carrying. Having another person in the bakery changed the rhythm of the days in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. It was louder, for one thing. Polly had opinions, and she expressed them, not rudely but consistently, about whether a batch was ready to shape, about whether the crust was the right color, about a customer who'd been rude that Tuesday, and whether Clara had been too tolerant about it. Clara, who had spent 4 months in near total silence, found it disorienting and then, gradually, necessary. The spring order from the ranch came in formally at the end of February, and it was larger than even Rhett's estimate had suggested. 32 men now, not 30, plus the main house order, which had grown to include a standing weekly supply of rolls and twice-monthly specialty bread. The numbers worked out to almost $12 a week, which was more than Clara had earned in any single week since before her father died. She sat down with the numbers 2 evenings in a row before she believed them. Then she ordered more flour, hired Polly at proper wages, and started getting up at 3:30 instead of 4. The town noticed. Durango in spring was a place paying attention to itself. The mud was clearing, the mines were ramping up for the warmer season, money was moving again after a hard winter, and people who'd been existing in survival mode were starting to think about improvement. In that context, a bakery that was visibly expanding its operation was something people remarked on. The woman at the dry goods store told Clara she'd heard the Mercer Ranch was buying most of the town's bread. A man named Fletcher, who owned the neighboring building, stopped her on the street to ask, in a careful roundabout way, whether she'd considered expanding her physical space, which she realized was him laying groundwork about the storeroom he had sitting empty next door. She wasn't ready for that, but she filed it away. What she wasn't prepared for was the reaction from some of the other townspeople, the ones who had opinions about how a young woman alone should be conducting herself. Mrs. Aldrich, the banker's wife, which was its own particular flavor of irony, stopped into the bakery one morning in early March and spent 15 minutes buying 2 loaves and finding ways to mention that it was quite unusual for a woman to be running deliveries out to a ranch alone. And had Clara considered whether that was entirely appropriate? Clara wrapped the loaves and counted back the change. "I consider whether my deliveries are appropriate based on whether the bread arrives in good condition," she said. "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Aldrich." Polly, who had been quietly restacking the shelf behind them, didn't say a word until the woman was out the door, and then she said, "I would have said something worse." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I went first." But it stung, if she was honest. Not because Mrs. Aldrich's opinion had any real weight with her, but because it was part of a pattern she'd been living inside for a year without naming it clearly. Every decision she made was observed and evaluated in a way that her father's decisions never had been. When George Whitlock had struggled with his debts, it had been bad luck and hard times. When Clara struggled with the same debts, it was evidence of the obvious unsuitability of women running businesses. She'd learned to take up less space in conversations, to present her confidence sideways, to get to the answer she wanted through a door that didn't look like ambition. She hated it, and she was very good at it, and she kept going. March moved toward April, and the road to the ranch dried out properly, and the cart rides became almost pleasant in the mornings. Cool, but not cold. the mountains still snow-capped against a paler sky, the sage starting to green at the lower elevations. She knew the South Road by heart now, every turn and soft spot, and the place where a creek crossed low enough to ford without slowing down. She knew the ranch, too, had learned its daily rhythms from the delivery gate, when the morning crew came in from the eastern pasture, when the kitchen fire at the main house sent its first smoke up, when Deacon moved between the bunkhouse and the barn on his predictable schedule. And she knew Rhett's schedule, though she hadn't meant to learn it. He was always at the gate for her Tuesday morning deliveries. For the Thursday ones, it was sometimes Deacon or one of the other hands. But Tuesday, reliably, was Rhett. She had stopped pretending, at least to herself, that this was only a business arrangement. She hadn't done anything about it, and she wasn't going to. There were too many reasons why the thinking needed to stop at the gate. He was the reason she had the contract, which meant any complication between them had a direct line to the only financial security she'd managed to build. And there was the larger, quieter problem. She'd watched her father run his life through his heart rather than his head, borrowing against hope, betting on feeling, and she'd spent a year cleaning up after the consequences of that. She didn't intend to make the same mistake, so she kept it to herself and went on working. It was the second Tuesday in April when Rhett's uncle, Edmund Mercer, came out to the gate himself. Clara had never met him. She'd seen him once at a distance, an older man crossing the yard between the main house and the barn, but they'd never spoken. He was in his 60s, broad through the chest, with a white beard trimmed close and the careful posture of a man who'd spent a long time on horseback. He looked at the crates with the specific attention of someone who'd been waiting to make this inspection. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She handed him the invoice. He looked at it briefly and set it aside. Then he opened the top crate and looked at the bread, and then he took a roll from the main house order, the cinnamon honey ones she'd been refining since January, now with the dried orange peel from Martinez at the general supply. And he ate it slowly, the way a man eats something he's deciding about. He was quiet for a long moment. "My wife made something like this," he said finally, not to Clara particularly, mostly to himself. "I was told she was from France," Clara said carefully. "Lyon." He looked at the remaining rolls. "She would have wanted to meet you." He picked up the invoice again. "Rhett speaks highly of your work." Clara glanced involuntarily toward the barn, where Rhett was visible through the open door working on something she couldn't see. "I'm glad the arrangement has been useful," she said. "Useful." Edmund Mercer seemed to taste the word and find it insufficient. "My men are eating better than they have in 3 years. Deacon told me last week that the bread situation—" He paused, a brief flicker of something like amusement. "Deacon has a particular way of—" "Has improved significantly," Clara finished. Edmund looked at her sharply, then laughed. A genuine, brief surprise sound, the laugh of a man who didn't do it often enough. "Yes, exactly." He handed the invoice to the ranch hand standing behind him. "We'll be extending the contract through the end of the year, Miss Whitlock. Same terms, with a 10% increase to account for the expanded order. Rhett will bring you the paperwork Thursday." He walked back towards the main house without ceremony. Clara loaded the empty crates onto the cart and kept her expression neutral until she was back on the South Road, and then she exhaled very slowly and let herself feel it for a moment. The solid, specific relief of a problem solved, not temporarily managed but actually solved, the bakery carrying its own weight for the first time since March of the previous year. She got back to town and told Polly, who said I knew it, with the absolute confidence of a 16-year-old who had in fact not known it at all, but wanted credit anyway. Clara let her have it. The event announcement came in the 3rd week of April. It was Rhett who told her on the Thursday delivery when he brought the contract extension. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, plainly, without softening, giving her the information she needed to work with. "My uncle is planning a gathering for the 1st week of June," he said. "A dinner celebration for the expansion. He's inviting ranchers from across the territory, La Plata County, some from as far as Montezuma and Archuleta. Maybe 100 guests." Clara was looking at the contract extension in her hands. She set it down on the gatepost. 100 guests. "He wants it to be significant, his first major event since my aunt died." Rhett paused. "He asked me to talk to you about the food before he approached anyone else." "What does he want?" "Bread for the dinner tables, obviously, but also—" rolls, specialty items for the dessert course, something that could serve as the centerpiece of the table presentation. He used the word impressive several times, which with my uncle means he's thought about it for a while. He looked at her steadily. I told him I needed to ask you first before he made any assumptions. Clara did the arithmetic. 100 guests, dinner service, specialty items, a centerpiece presentation. She had 6 weeks. She had Polly. She had 2 ovens. What's his budget? She asked. He said, name your price within reason. What's his definition of reason? Generous. Rhett leaned on the gatepost. I want to be honest with you. This is bigger than anything you've done before. I know that. If it goes badly, I know that too. She picked up the contract extension. If it goes well, every rancher in 3 counties knows my name. He was quiet. I'll do it, she said. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything. She folded the contract and put it in her coat pocket. But I'm doing it. The 6 weeks between that conversation and the June dinner were the hardest stretch of work Clara had done since the 1st January after her father died. And they were hard in a different way. Not the desperate survival mode hard of trying to keep the lights on, but the concentrated, demanding hard of trying to do something genuinely difficult at a level she hadn't attempted before. She spent the first week in planning, which she'd never had the luxury of doing before. She sat with Polly at the work table in the evenings, and they mapped out the full menu, how many loaves, how many rolls, what the dessert presentation would involve, what could be made in advance, and what needed to be day of. She wrote everything down in a ledger she'd bought specifically for this, and she revised it 3 times before she was satisfied that the timeline was real and not wishful. The centerpiece was the problem she circled back to every night. Edmund Mercer wanted impressive. He wanted something that would make ranchers from Archuleta County look at the table and remember it. Clara had ideas, but she was honest with herself about the gap between having an idea and executing it reliably at scale. She tried 3 different approaches in the kitchen over the first 2 weeks. A structured bread wreath she'd seen in a recipe book her mother had brought from Ohio, an elaborate layered roll arrangement, a tall country loaf with scored patterning across the crust. The wreath was too fragile for transport. The roll arrangement was beautiful, but fell apart when anyone reached for a piece, which defeated the purpose of food. The scored country loaf was the closest, and she worked on the scoring pattern for 4 evenings, burning through flour she couldn't really spare on experiments, until she had a version that held its shape through transport and held its presentation through a 2-hour dinner. Polly watched the 4th attempt come out of the oven and said, "That's the one," with the quiet certainty she'd been developing. "The scoring on the left side is uneven," Clara said. "Nobody at a dinner party is measuring the scoring." Polly set the loaf on the cooling rack. "They're going to look at it and think someone who cares made this." Clara looked at it. The girl wasn't wrong. She wrote to Edmund Mercer with the full proposal: quantities, timing, delivery logistics, and price, and waited 3 days for the response, which arrived as a note delivered by one of the ranch hands. Accepted in full. "We look forward to it. E. Mercer." She put the note in the ledger with her planning papers. 2 weeks before the event, she ran into a problem she hadn't planned for. The grain supplier in Pueblo sent word that her standing order for June would be short by a quarter due to a supply disruption upstream. She needed that flour. She'd based the entire production timeline on having it. She spent a day trying to solve it through her usual supplier before she accepted that she couldn't. Then she went to every dry goods and general supply store in Durango and bought out their stock of bread flour, which was more expensive than the bulk rate and left her with less margin than she'd planned for. She recalculated the numbers. She was still profitable, but not by as much as she'd expected, and the buffer she'd been counting on was gone. She told Polly not to worry her, but because Polly had a right to know the situation they were working in. Polly nodded and said, "Then we don't waste anything." They didn't waste anything. The 2 weeks before the dinner were a sustained, concentrated effort that ran from 3 in the morning until 9 at night. Clara and Polly worked in shifts. Clara took the early mornings for the precision work, the specialty items, the things that required her specific experience, and Polly handled the high-volume production of standard loaves in the later morning, which she'd gotten genuinely good at. They didn't talk much while they worked. They'd developed the shared language of a kitchen that was running, the shorthand of people who know what each other needs before it's asked. Rhett came by the bakery on the Wednesday before the event, which he'd never done before. He'd always waited for her to come to the ranch. She was elbow-deep in dough when the door opened, and she looked up, expecting a customer. He stood in the doorway and looked at the organized, controlled chaos of the production. The cooling racks full, the work table covered, Polly counting rolls at the far end, and something in his expression shifted. "I came to ask if you needed anything," he said. "I needed more flour 2 weeks ago," Claire said. "I managed it." "I heard. Martinez told me you cleaned him out." Martinez gossips. Everybody in Durango gossips. He stepped inside, which he'd never done before, and looked at the bread on the cooling racks with the careful attention he gave everything. "The scored loaves. How many are you making?" "6. 1 for each main table." He looked at the one nearest him. The scoring had come out right, better than right, actually, clean and deliberate across the top of the crust in a pattern she'd settled on after all the experiments. "My uncle is going to be pleased," Rhett said. "I hope so." She went back to the dough. "He's paying for pleased." There was a pause. She heard him move slightly, but didn't look up. "Clara." He said her name the way he sometimes said things, plainly, without preamble, like he'd decided to say it and was going to say it. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She looked up. "You've built something real here," he said. "Whatever happened Saturday, you've already built something real." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the dough, because she didn't entirely trust what her face might do if she kept looking at him. "Come back Saturday," she said, "and tell me that after." He left. Polly, across the room, didn't say anything, which was unusual enough that Clara looked over at her. The girl was very carefully not smiling. "Don't," Clara said. "I didn't say anything," Polly said, in the voice of someone who was saying everything. The morning of the dinner, Clara and Polly loaded the cart in the dark at 4:30. Every loaf wrapped, every roll counted, every scored centerpiece braced in its own padded section of the crate so the jostling wouldn't crack the crust. Clara had checked everything twice the night before, and once more that morning. The cart was heavier than it had ever been for a single delivery, and Beans the horse looked at the load with mild resentment before accepting it. The road to the ranch was dry, the sky clear, the mountains pink at the edges where the sun was coming. Clara kept the pace slow on the curves and let herself breathe. There was nothing more to prepare. She had done everything she could do. Whatever happened next was already in the bread, in the weeks of work behind it, in the decisions she'd made, and the one she'd corrected, and the one loaf she'd burned on the last experiment before she'd gotten the scoring right. At the ranch gate, Rhett was waiting. He looked at the loaded cart and then at her face. "How do you feel?" he asked. Clara considered the question honestly. Her back hurt. She was running on 5 hours of sleep. She had flour in her hair that she'd missed when she'd checked the mirror. "Ready," she said, and meant it. They unloaded the cart together, Rhett and 2 of the ranch hands carrying the heavier crates while Clara managed the scored centerpiece loaves herself, one at a time, because she didn't trust anyone else's hands with them on the final stretch. The main house had been transformed overnight. Long tables set end to end in the great room and spilling out onto the covered porch, white cloth borrowed from somewhere. Lanterns hung along the eave line. It looked like something Edmund Mercer had been planning for a long time and had finally allowed himself to do. The ranch cook, a heavy-set woman named Inez who had run the Mercer kitchen for 6 years, met Clara at the back entrance with the specific expression of a person who has strong territorial feelings about their workspace and is working to be civil about an intrusion. "You're the baker," Inez said. "Clara Whitlock." Inez looked at the crates. "How do you want them?" "Bread stays wrapped until an hour before service. The centerpiece loaves need a dry surface, away from the steam if you're doing anything with boiling water before dinner." Inez considered this. "I'm doing 3 pots of beans." Then the far end of the prep table, away from the stove side. There was a brief charged silence, the kind that happens when 2 competent people in a small space are deciding whether to be adversaries or not. Then Inez moved to the far end of the prep table and cleared it without being asked again, and that was how they resolved it. Clara worked in the kitchen for 2 hours, setting up the timing for the bread service, when to unwrap, when to arrange on the serving board she'd brought, how to handle the centerpiece loaves so they went to the tables intact. Inez watched without interfering and occasionally handed her things she needed before she asked for them, which Clara took as a form of professional acknowledgement. By mid-morning, the kitchen was organized, the bread was staged, and Clara was standing at the back door of the main house with nothing left to do until service, which was 6 hours away. It was an odd feeling. She'd been in motion for 6 weeks, and now there was a gap, and she didn't know what to do with herself in it. Rhett found her there. "Kitchen is ready?" he asked. "As ready as it can be." She looked out at the yard where hands were setting up additional seating on the porch. "Inez runs a tight operation. She's been with my uncle since before my aunt died. She practically kept the household together after." He leaned against the doorframe. "She doesn't like most people who come into her kitchen. She tolerates me." For Inez, that's practically an endorsement. He was quiet a moment. "You should walk the grounds. You've been delivering here for months and you've never seen the north side." Clara looked at him. "I have work to... in 6 hours." He straightened. "Come on." She went, partly because she was tired of standing at the back door, and partly because she was honest with herself about this. She wanted to. He walked her north from the main house along a fence line that ran toward the higher ground, past the new barn still wearing its raw lumber smell, past the stock pens where the ranch's cattle moved slow and heavy in the morning warmth. The San Juan Mountains were fully visible from the north ridge, still carrying their snow, white against the deep blue that Colorado sky did in June. The valley below the ranch spread wide and green, the creek line visible as a darker thread through the sage and grass. "My uncle bought 300 acres in March," Rhett said, looking out at it. "The parcel's to the northeast. We broke ground on the new pens last week." "How long until it's running?" 2 years, maybe, if the seasons cooperate." He sat down on a flat rock near the fence line. It was a natural thing to do in that spot, the kind of rock that had been serving as a sitting place for years. "He wants me to manage the expansion." Clara sat down a few feet away. "Is that what you want?" He looked at her sideways, the way people look when they're surprised by a direct question and haven't decided yet whether they like it. "Why do you ask it that way?" "Because you said what he wants, not what you want." He was quiet for a moment. A hawk crossed the valley below them, very high, barely moving. "I came out here from New Mexico because he asked me to," Rhett said. "He needed someone he trusted to get the operation organized. I thought it was a temporary arrangement." He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hand. "But it stopped feeling temporary sometime around February." Clara didn't say anything. "I've been in a lot of places," he said. "I don't usually stay." He paused. "I'm staying." It was not a declaration. He didn't say it like one. He said it like a man reporting a fact about himself that he was still getting used to. She appreciated the difference. "I didn't intend to still be in Durango either," she said. "After my father died, I thought about leaving. There was nothing here for me except the debt." She looked at the mountains. "But I kept waking up every morning and going back to the ovens. At some point, that becomes a choice, even if it didn't start as one." He nodded slowly. "The starter," he said. "What?" "Your father's sourdough starter. You kept it going. You could have let it die. It's easier not to tend something." He looked at her directly. "But you tended it." Clara looked back at him. He was not talking about bread, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to say so out loud. Not today, not with 100 guests arriving in 6 hours, and a dinner that needed her attention, and a business arrangement that was the foundation of everything she'd built in the last 6 months. She stood up. "I should check on the kitchen." "You should." He stood too. "Clara." Again her name, plain and deliberate. She waited. "Whatever they say about you tonight, and they will talk, those ranchers, they always do, you should know that what you've done this year is not a small thing, not to anyone who's been paying attention." She held that for a moment, let it land without deflecting it. "Thank you," she said simply. They walked back to the main house without saying much else, but it was a different kind of quiet than the practical silences of the delivery mornings. It had something in it. The guests began arriving at 4 in the afternoon, wagons and horses coming up the main road from 3 directions, men in their better coats with their wives beside them, the particular dressed-up formality of frontier people who didn't get many occasions for it and were making the most of this one. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway as Edmund Mercer stood on the porch and received each arrival with the unhurried ease of a man who'd been doing this for decades, the kind of ease that wealth and the right personality made possible. She recognized some of the names from the county records. the Halstead operation out of Bayfield, the Cormack brothers who ran cattle between Durango and Aztec, a rancher named Prescott from up near Silverton, who everyone seemed to treat with particular deference. These were not small operators. These were the men who between them owned half the grazing land in the San Juan Basin. She went back to her bread. The service started at 6. Inez ran her kitchen like a military campaign, which Clara respected, and the bread service worked exactly as planned. The wrapped loaves opened precisely, the rolls arranged on the boards, the scored centerpiece loaves carried to the tables by the 2 youngest ranch hands who'd been specifically briefed on not tilting the boards. Clara stood at the kitchen doorway and watched the first centerpiece go to the main table and watched Edmund Mercer look at it. He touched the scoring lightly with one finger. He said something to the man beside him. Prescott, she realized. And Prescott leaned forward to look at it and then looked toward the kitchen. Clara stepped back from the doorway. "They're looking for you," Inez said, without turning from the stove. "Let them look." Inez made a sound that might have been a laugh. The dinner ran 2 hours. Clara spent most of it in the kitchen, helping Inez with the timing of courses, keeping track of the bread supply so that the tables were never empty, managing the small disasters that are inevitable in large service. A dropped roll tray that Polly, who Clara had brought along for the day, caught before it hit the ground. A centerpiece loaf at the far table that had been cut in a way that destabilized the scoring pattern and needed to be quietly replaced with the spare she'd had the foresight to bring. At the end of the main course, she heard Edmund Mercer's voice carry from the great room. He was making a toast. She could hear the cadence of it without the words. Then she heard her name. Miss Clara Whitlock, whose bakery has been supplying this ranch since December, and whose work tonight has honored this occasion in a way my wife would have recognized and appreciated. The room responded. Clara stood at the kitchen counter with her hands braced on the edge and looked at the wall and breathed carefully. Inez put a glass of water beside her hand without comment. Afterward, while the guests moved to the porch and the evening settled into the particular warm looseness of a successful dinner party, 3 men came to the kitchen door. Not together, separately, over the course of about 40 minutes, each one with the slightly self-conscious manner of a man who wants something and is aware that asking for it directly might be less effective than presenting it as a compliment first. The first was a ranch manager from the Halstead operation, a lean man named Guthrie, who said the rolls were the best he'd had since Kansas City, and did Miss Whitlock take orders from outside of Durango? Clara said she did, with appropriate lead time, and took his name and location on a piece of paper she'd borrowed from Inez's kitchen ledger. The second was the Cormack brother, who handled the business side of their operation, shorter, more direct, not bothering with the compliment preamble, who asked flatly if she could supply their spring branding events, which ran 4 days in May and fed 60 to 80 people. Clara said she'd need to see the specific requirements and asked him to come to the bakery in Durango the following week. The third was Prescott. He was older than she'd expected up close, maybe 60, with a white mustache and the particular physical authority of someone who had never in his adult life been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He looked around the kitchen before he looked at her, which was a habit of the very wealthy, assessed the environment before engaging the person. "You made the centerpiece bread," he said. "Yes. My wife has been trying to find someone who can provide for our harvest celebration since our old baker moved to Denver 2 years ago." He looked at her steadily. "That's 3 days in September. 60 guests minimum, probably closer to 75. Full dinner service, specialty items, the works." Clara kept her expression level. Prescott's ranch was up near Silverton, which was a significant distance and a more difficult road than the Mercer delivery. "I'd need to review the logistics." "Of course." He reached into his coat and produced a card, an actual printed card, which almost nobody in this part of Colorado carried, and set it on the kitchen counter. "Come and see me when you're ready to talk about it. Bring your numbers." He went back to the porch. Clara looked at the card for a moment, then she put it carefully in the same pocket with Guthrie's name and the Cormack brothers' request. Red appeared at the kitchen doorway a few minutes later. He'd been on the porch with the guests, but he'd been watching the kitchen, she realized. She'd caught the edge of him twice in the corner of her vision during the evening. "Prescott talked to you," he said. "He did." "He doesn't talk to vendors. He sends a man." He looked at her with that steady attention of his. "He talked to you himself." "I noticed." Rhett was quiet a moment. How are you feeling about tonight? Tired. She started gathering the empty crates. And she paused, searching for the right word. Not triumphant, which was too large. Not simply relieved, which was too small. Like something shifted, she said finally, in a way that's real. He nodded. He picked up the nearest crate. You don't have to, she started. I know I don't have to. He picked it up anyway. They loaded the cart in the late evening, the lantern light from the porch casting long shadows across the yard, the sound of conversation still carrying from inside. Polly loaded the last of the boards and then sat on the back of the empty cart with her feet dangling, looking up at the sky, which was extraordinary, clear and cold and dense with stars in the way that only happened at this elevation, away from town. I've never worked an event like that, Polly said, to no one in particular. Neither have I, Clara said. Polly looked at her with some surprise, as if it hadn't occurred to her that Clara could be doing something for the first time. Clara climbed up to the cart seat and took the reins. Rhett stood at the horse's head for a moment, steadying Beans, who was restless in the unfamiliar evening activity. He looked up at Clara on the seat. The South Road is fine tonight, dry all the way. I know the South Road. I know you do. A pause. I'll come by the bakery Thursday, if that's all right. It wasn't a delivery day. They both knew it wasn't a delivery day. Thursday is fine, Clara said. She clicked her tongue at Beans and the cart moved forward into the dark. Behind her, Polly was quiet for once, looking up at the stars or pretending to. The ranch lights receded behind them on the South Road, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky so full of stars it almost hurt to look at. And Clara held the reins loosely and let herself sit inside the evening for a moment without managing it. Something had shifted. She'd said it to Rhett, and it was true. But it was true in more directions than she'd named. The business was different now. After tonight, after those 3 men at the kitchen door, after Prescott's card in her pocket, she was not a struggling bakery fighting to stay solvent. She was something else, something with a shape she hadn't had before. And Thursday wasn't a delivery day, and Rhett was coming anyway, and she had decided she was going to stop pretending that didn't mean what it meant. Polly said, from the back of the cart, He looked at you like that all evening, you know. I don't think he knew he was doing it. Polly, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Then you know I'm right. Clara didn't answer. The South Road ran smooth and dry beneath the wheels, the way Rhett had said it would, and Durango's lights were coming up ahead through the dark. She let herself smile, briefly, in the direction of the horse's ears where nobody could see it. She was very tired, and something real had shifted, and Thursday was 2 days away. Thursday came in hot and dry, the way June mornings in Durango did when the season had fully committed to itself. Clara was in the middle of the second batch when she heard the door, and she knew before she looked up that it was him. Not because of anything specific, just the particular quality of the silence that preceded it, the pause before the latch. Rhett came in without the canvas duster. It was the first time she'd seen him in town without it, and he looked different without the trail weight of it. Younger, maybe, or just more present, like a thing set down that had been carried a long time. He was wearing a plain dark shirt, and his hat was in his hand, which he almost never did. You're early, Clara said. I know. He looked at the loaves on the cooling rack. I can wait. You can help. She nodded at the stack of pans on the side counter. Grease those. He found the lard without asking where it was, which she noticed, and started on the pans with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who'd done it before. Polly was in the back room sorting the flour sacks and either hadn't heard him come in or had made a tactical decision to stay where she was. Clara suspected the latter. They worked in the same kitchen silence she had developed with Polly, except that it was different, denser, more aware of itself. She shaped loaves and he greased pans and the oven made its low, constant work sound, and outside on the street Durango went about its Thursday morning. After a while he said, Prescott sent a man to the ranch yesterday. Clara looked up. About the harvest celebration? About you specifically. He wanted to know from my uncle how long you'd been operating, whether you were reliable, whether the quality was consistent. Rhett set down the last greased pan. My uncle told him you were the best business decision he'd made since buying the land. Clara absorbed that. What did Prescott's man say? He wrote something down and rode back toward Silverton. Rhett leaned on the counter. Prescott doesn't do anything quickly, but when he decides, it's decided. I know the type. She loaded the shaped loaves into the pans. Mrs. Aldrich came in yesterday, too. The banker's wife. She bought a loaf of the sourdough and told me she'd heard the dinner at the Mercer Ranch was a great success, and that it was remarkable what could be accomplished with determination. Clara slid the pans toward the oven. She said determination the way some people say luck, like it was something slightly embarrassing that had worked out despite itself. Rhett was quiet a moment. Does that bother you? It used to bother me more. She closed the oven door. Now it mostly just tells me something about where she stands. She turned to face him. People like Mrs. Aldrich were going to say what they said regardless of what I did. So I stopped adjusting for them and started adjusting for the work. He looked at her with that steady, considered attention she'd gotten used to, the kind that didn't rush toward a response. That's not a small thing to learn, he said. It took me most of a year. Most things worth knowing do. Polly appeared from the back room with the careful timing of someone who had been listening for a lull. She looked at Rhett, looked at Clara, set a flour sack on the table with great deliberateness, and said she was going to the general supply for the morning order and would be back in an hour. She was gone before Clara could respond. Rhett watched the door close. She's very subtle. She's 16 and has no subtlety whatsoever. Clara untied her apron, retied it at a better angle because her hands needed something to do. You came on a Thursday. It's not a delivery day. I know. So, he picked up his hat from the counter, turned it once in his hands, set it back down. A small, uncharacteristic fidget. I've been trying to figure out the right way to say something for about 4 months. 4 months? She calculated backwards. Since February. Probably before February. He looked at her directly, which was how he looked at everything, but it was different now. The directness carrying something it didn't usually carry. I kept telling myself it was the wrong time, that you had too much at stake, and I had no right to add something to that. That was considerate, she said carefully. It was also convenient, because if the timing was wrong, I didn't have to do the harder thing. He paused. The dinner is done. The contract is extended. You've got Prescott's card in your pocket and 2 other ranchers who want to talk to you. The timing argument doesn't hold anymore. Clara stood in her bakery with the oven warming the room and the bread doing what bread did and looked at Rhett Mercer, who had walked in before sunrise on a December morning and bought every loaf she had and then kept coming back. And she thought about what it meant that she'd noticed the road conditions improving before she arrived, and the sand on the icy gate approach, and the way he'd ridden alongside the cart on the South Road without making it into anything, and the way he'd said, I'm staying up on the North Ridge like it was a fact he was still learning about himself. You didn't keep coming back just for the bread, she said. No. Simply. No qualification. How long have you known that? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Probably since you told Deacon the price to his face on the first delivery and didn't flinch. He almost smiled, but I was aware of it consciously around February. The South Road, she said. He nodded. Clara leaned back against the work table. I've been being careful, she said, about this, because everything I've built in the last 6 months runs through the ranch contract and I couldn't afford to. I know. He said it without impatience. That's why I waited. I'm still being careful, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to stop being careful just because... She paused. Just because I want to. Something shifted in his expression. Not the almost smile, something more complete than that. Something that had been held back for a while and was now not being held back. I don't want you to stop being careful, he said. I want you to be exactly who you are. I've been watching who you are for 6 months. That was the moment. Not a dramatic moment. No particular music to it. No convenient lighting. She was standing in a flour-dusted apron in a working bakery at 8:30 in the morning, and he was standing across the work table from her with his hat in his hand, and it was as unglamorous and real as anything in her life had ever been. Come for dinner Saturday, she said. Not the ranch. Here, I'll cook something that isn't bread. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the almost laugh, the real one, which was lower and less controlled and completely different, and said, yes. That was how it started. Not with ceremony, but with a dinner that she burned slightly on one side because she was more nervous than she'd expected to be. And he ate it without comment and helped her wash the pan after. And they talked until the candles burned low, and when he left, she stood in the doorway of the bakery in the warm June night and knew that she'd let something in that she wasn't going to be able to put back, and found she didn't want to. The summer moved fast the way busy summers do, each week folding into the next before you'd finished accounting for the current one. The Cormack Brothers branding event came in late June. 4 days, 73 people, and a logistics problem she hadn't fully anticipated. Delivery to a site 12 miles out on bad road 3 times over 4 days, which meant either hiring a second cart or renting one and handling the driving herself. She rented the second cart and drove it herself, with Polly managing the bakery on the supply days. It was brutal, and it worked, and the Cormack brothers paid promptly and asked about next year before she'd finished loading the empty crates. Prescott's letter arrived in July. Formal, brief, the kind of language that communicated money without mentioning it. He was engaged Miss Whitlock's services for the harvest celebration in September. 3 days, a minimum of 75 guests, full dinner service. He had noted her rate from the Mercer dinner and considered it appropriate. A deposit would be sent by end of the week. The deposit arrived by Thursday. It was more than she'd made in any single week since opening the bakery. She sat with the check for a long time. Then she went next door to Fletcher's building and had the conversation about the storeroom. It cost her most of the deposit, which she hadn't planned on doing. She'd planned on saving it, building the reserve she'd never had, being conservative the way hard experience had taught her to be. But she stood in the storeroom next door, which smelled like old grain and possibility, and she ran the numbers and ran them again, and she understood that the bottleneck in her business was not customers. She had customers now, more than she could reliably serve. It was production space. Without a third oven, without room to expand the prep operation, she was going to hit a ceiling in the next season and then start turning down orders, which would mean Prescott going somewhere else and the Cormack brothers going somewhere else, and the whole careful structure she'd built beginning to contract. She spent the deposit on the storeroom and a third oven that a hardware merchant in Durango had in his back lot, second-hand but sound. And by August, she had knocked through the wall between the bakery and the storeroom, and Polly was managing the new prep space with 2 girls she'd recruited herself from the Western Residential District, both of them young and willing and fast learners. Clara stood in the expanded bakery one evening in August, after everyone had gone home, and looked at what the space had become. 3 ovens, 4 people including herself, a weekly order from the Mercer Ranch, standing orders from 2 other operations, and Prescott's harvest celebration coming in September. Flour sacks stacked properly now, not crammed into whatever corner would hold them. The ledger on the shelf above the cooling rack, which she checked every Sunday evening, showing numbers she hadn't imagined on that December morning when she'd stood at the work table with the bank letter in her apron pocket. She thought about her father, not with the sharp grief of the early months, but with the mellowed particular sadness that comes when you've lived enough beyond a loss to see what the person missed. George Whitlock would have loved this. He'd have walked through the knocked-through wall into the new prep space and touched the third oven's surface the way he'd touched the second one when it was new, with the pride of a man who'd built something by believing in it. He wouldn't have believed the Prescott contract. He'd have made Clara explain it twice. She missed him, and the missing was okay. It wasn't the kind that stopped her anymore. Rhett came to the bakery on Thursday evenings through the summer. Sometimes they cooked. She'd gotten better at not burning things mostly, and he turned out to have a genuine hand with meat, which he'd been modest about. And sometimes they walked the ridge north of town where the sage smelled sharp in the evening heat and the mountains stayed lit long after the town went into shadow. He talked about the ranch's expansion, the complications of managing a crew of 30 in a second season, the way his uncle was starting to pull back from the daily operations and lean on Rhett to carry more of it. She talked about the business, the calculations she was making about the next season, what the Prescott relationship might open up further into the territory. They were both people who thought in practical terms, and they talked in practical terms, and underneath the practical terms was something that kept growing without requiring much tending, which maybe meant it was the right kind of thing, the kind that doesn't need to be forced into shape. There were hard nights, too. An evening in July when she'd had a terrible Tuesday, 2 batches ruined by a flour supply problem that had left her short for the ranch delivery, and she'd been short with Polly and felt bad about it, and then been short with Rhett when he came Thursday, not meaning to be, but not entirely able to stop it. He'd sat with it for a while without taking it personally or making it about himself, which was harder than it sounds. And after a while, she'd said she was sorry, and he'd said there was nothing to be sorry for, and she'd said there absolutely was, and he'd said, all right, a small something to be sorry for, and she'd laughed in spite of herself, and that had been the end of it. There was a night in August when he'd been quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, a kind of contained tension she hadn't seen before. And when she asked about it directly, he'd told her there was a boundary dispute on the ranch's northeastern parcels. A rancher named Caswell, who'd been moving fence lines and claiming the eastern creek was on his land when the survey clearly showed it wasn't. It had been going on for weeks, a slow grinding conflict that hadn't turned ugly yet, but had the shape of something that was moving in that direction. He'd had 3 conversations with Caswell that had gone nowhere, and Edmund was talking about lawyers, and Rhett was talking about the fact that lawyers cost money and time and made enemies permanent. What would settle it? Clara asked. A clear survey, filed with the county, witnessed by someone Caswell can't dismiss. He turned his coffee cup on the table. He's not going to back down from me or my uncle. He's been in this county longer than we have, and he knows it. Who has he backed down from in the past? Rhett thought about it. Prescott. Prescott's been here 30 years and has enough standing that nobody... He stopped. He looked at her. I'm going to Silverton in 2 weeks for the harvest preparation meeting, Clara said. I could mention it to Prescott, not ask him to intervene, just mention it. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask me. I'm offering. She looked at him steadily. Prescott respects practical people. I'm a practical person he's just started doing business with. If I mention that my supplier, your ranch, is in a boundary dispute with someone who's known to be difficult, and that it's potentially affecting my operations, it's not actually affecting your operations. Not yet. She held his gaze. It's not a lie. It could. He was quiet for a while. You'd be using a business relationship for something personal. I'm using a business relationship for something practical, she said. There's a difference. He didn't entirely look comfortable with it. She didn't entirely expect him to be, but he also didn't say no, because he was honest enough to recognize that it was a good solution. She mentioned it to Prescott in Silverton in the course of a longer conversation about regional supply chain reliability, 2 weeks later. Not conspicuously, just as a piece of information that a practical businesswoman might pass along to an established county figure. Prescott had listened, asked 2 questions, and moved on to the next topic. 3 weeks after that, Caswell pulled his fence line back to the original survey boundary without explanation or apology. The dispute ended the way some disputes do, not with resolution, just with someone deciding the cost had exceeded the value. Rhett heard about it on a Tuesday. He came to the bakery Thursday evening and told her, and then he said, I don't know how to thank you for that. You could start by not thanking me at all, she said. I did something practical that helped people I care about. That's not a debt. He looked at her for a long moment. People I care about, he repeated quietly. That's what I said. He was across the work table from her, the same position they'd been in on the Thursday in June when this had started, and he reached across it and took her hand, not dramatically, just picked it up and held it on the flour-dusted surface of the table, and she let him. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly, not practically. I can try. Do you want this to be permanent? She looked at their hands on the table. Her fingers were calloused from the kneading and the oven work, and his were rough from the fence work and the horses, and neither of them had particularly soft hands, which seemed right. Yes, she said. I want it to be permanent. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I don't have a ring. I didn't ask for a ring. I'm getting you a ring. I'm just telling you I don't have it yet. She laughed. The surprised kind, the real kind. And he was smiling, the full version. And outside on the Durango street, the summer evening was doing what summer evenings in Colorado do, going gold and long and slow, the mountains turning that particular shade of violet that happened for maybe 20 minutes at dusk and then was gone. The ring came 2 weeks later. It was not a grand ring. A simple silver band with a small turquoise stone bought from the silversmith on the main street who did most of his trade with the mining families and therefore kept his prices honest. Rhett gave it to her in the bakery on a Thursday morning, not in the evening, but morning, because she'd come in early and he'd come early with her. And he said, "I wanted to do this in the place that makes the most sense." And she understood that he meant the bakery, meant the flour and the ovens and the whole accumulated weight of what she'd built here, and she thought that was the most correct thing he could have said. She said yes, obviously. She'd already said yes. They married the following May, in a small ceremony at the Durango courthouse with Edmund Mercer and Polly's mother and Deacon, who showed up in a clean coat that surprised everyone, as the witnesses. There was no reception because Clara was in the middle of a production week and couldn't afford to lose 2 days to celebration. Rhett had said that was fine. She'd said she'd make it up to him when the season was slower. He'd said he didn't need it made up. It was not a perfect wedding. The courthouse clerk misspelled Whitlock on the first certificate and had to redo it, which took 20 minutes. Polly cried, which she'd firmly stated she wouldn't do. Edmund made a short speech that was clearly covering for more emotion than he intended to show, and stumbled over a word and then looked at the ceiling briefly and recovered. Deacon shook Rhett's hand with the solemnity of a man performing a ritual he'd thought about in advance. Clara stood in the May sunshine outside the courthouse with her new husband beside her and her silver and turquoise ring on her hand, and thought about the December morning when she'd been standing at the work table at 4 a.m. with the bank letter in her pocket and the $2 silver on the counter, and the man she hadn't expected who'd come in from the cold and bought everything she had. Not every door that opens is the one you thought you needed. Sometimes the door is a man who wants bread before sunrise, and you can't see what's behind it from where you're standing, and the only way to know is to open it. The years that followed were not easy years. The frontier didn't do easy years. There were 2 summers of drought between 1885 and 1887 that hit the ranch operations hard across the territory, and Rhett managed those seasons with the grim, methodical patience of someone who'd grown up understanding that the land didn't owe you anything. Clara watched him work through it and understood something she'd only half known before, that strength, real strength, wasn't the absence of difficulty. It was the willingness to show up the next morning anyway, not because you were certain it would get better, but because you didn't know how to do anything else. She had her own hard seasons. The spring of 1886 brought a grain blight that disrupted the supply chain across 3 counties and forced her to rebuild her supplier network almost from scratch. She lost the Halstead contract that year when the operation changed hands, and the new owners wanted a Denver supplier. It stung more than she expected, not because of the money, which she could absorb by then, but because she'd built that relationship carefully, and the new owners had dismissed it without any real evaluation. Rhett listened to her talk about it on a Thursday evening and didn't try to fix it, which was what she needed. "You'll get another one," he said. "I know that." She looked at her coffee. "I just hate that it doesn't matter to them what I built. It matters to you." He was quiet a moment. "And it matters to the people who are still there, the ones who notice." She thought about Deacon saying the bread situation has improved significantly, and the way Martinez at the General Supply always had her dried orange peel set aside before she asked, and the Cormack brothers who'd been with her every spring for 3 years now and had never once been late with a payment. She thought about Polly, who was 20 now and managing the expanded bakery operation with 2 assistants of her own and a competence that had long since passed anything Clara had specifically taught her. The Halstead account wasn't the point. The Halstead account was just an account. They had their first child in 1887, a girl they named Ruth after Rhett's mother. She was born in February, which was inconvenient for bakery operations, and she arrived 2 weeks early, which was inconvenient for everyone, and she screamed at volumes that made Deacon, who came to pay his respects, look genuinely alarmed. Clara held her in the back room of the bakery. She'd been too close to her shift to go anywhere else when the labor started, and thought that this was the least dignified way in which any of the major events of her life had occurred, and felt entirely fine about that. Rhett held Ruth with the careful, slightly terrified attention of a man who was good with large animals, and was recalibrating for something much smaller. He got better at it quickly, because he got better at things quickly when he decided they mattered. A boy came 2 years later. They named him George. Edmund Mercer held George the afternoon he was born, and didn't say anything for a while, and then said, "He looks like he knows something," which was the kind of statement that didn't entirely make sense, and that everyone in the room understood perfectly. Edmund was slower by then. Not diminished, exactly, but quieter in the way that men in their late 60s get quiet. the energy drawing inward. He was spending less time in the operational side of the ranch and more time on the porch of the main house, watching the valley, occasionally writing letters to people Clara never met but heard about through Rhett. He was still sharp, still precise with money, still capable of an observation that cut to the center of something in one sentence. But he was preparing for a transition, and he and Rhett both knew it, and they'd started having the conversations that needed to be had about what came next. The ranch transferred to Rhett's management formally in 1891. By then, the Mercer operation covered nearly 800 acres, employed 40 people at peak season, and had a reputation in the San Juan Basin that reached across the territorial lines into New Mexico. Rhett took it on with the same methodical steadiness he brought to everything. Not with drama, not with a sense of arrival, just with a morning that was different from the one before it, and a set of new responsibilities added to the ones he already carried. Edmund moved into a smaller house on the property's southern edge. He came to dinner at the main house twice a week and continued to have opinions about everything, which Rhett absorbed with patience and Clara found quietly entertaining. The bakery kept growing. By 1890, Whitlock's had 3 locations. The original on Main Street, a second in a newer commercial district that had developed on Durango's eastern edge, and a supply operation she'd established in partnership with a woman in Silverton named Agnes, who handled Prescott's account directly and had expanded into 4 other operations in the Silverton area. Clara managed the whole operation from Durango, which meant the ledger work on Sunday evenings had become its own substantial job. Polly ran the original location, which she'd been doing effectively for 2 years. Clara had accepted, with something between pride and a slight pang, that Polly no longer needed much direction from her. That was what success actually looked like, she'd come to understand. Not the moment of triumph, the moment when the thing you'd built could run without you managing every part of it. Ruth grew up in the bakery the way Clara had grown up in the bakery, knowing the smell of the ovens before she knew most other things, learning to tell by touch when the dough was right, eating her breakfast at the work table while the morning batches cooled. She had Rhett's eyes and Clara's stubbornness, and a personality that was entirely her own, which arrived with clear force at around age 4 and never softened. George grew up on the ranch the way Rhett had grown up, learning the animals and the land and the particular physical intelligence of outdoor work, the way you read weather and ground and the behavior of cattle. He was gentler than his father in some ways, quicker to laugh, with a capacity for easy conversation that neither parent had ever fully possessed. He made friends without effort. He was going to be good at the people side of the ranch business in a way that Rhett had learned to be good at it, but Ruth had never come naturally to. Clara watched them both and thought, with the particular clarity that comes from having nearly lost everything before anything was built, about what it meant to make something that outlasted you. Not legacy in the monumental sense, not a name on a building, just the specific, durable fact of a set of skills and values passed from one set of hands to another. Ruth could bake sourdough from the 11-year starter, now a 20-year starter, still alive, still fed on its weekly schedule. George could read a boundary survey and a weather front and the mood of a herd. Both of them knew what it cost to build something because they'd grown up watching the cost being paid. That was the inheritance that mattered, not the property, not the accounts, the knowledge of what things were actually worth. It was the autumn of 1893, a decade, almost exactly, from the December morning when the whole thing had started, that Clara found herself standing on the north ridge of the Mercer Ranch, the same flat rock she and Rhett had sat on before the June dinner all those years ago. She'd come up alone in the early evening, after the bakery's end-of-week accounting and before dinner at the main house, needing 20 minutes of the particular quiet that this spot provided. The valley was going amber in the fall light. The mountains were already carrying the first snow of the season, white at the high elevations, the line descending as October progressed. The ranch below was visible in its full current form, the expanded barns, the crew quarters, the kitchen garden that Agnes had planted years ago and that now occupied a serious portion of the south yard, the new storage buildings on the eastern side. Smoke from the main house chimney. Somewhere down there, Rhett was going over the fall tallying with the foreman. Ruth was at the bakery covering the late afternoon. George was probably at the stock pens. Clara sat on the flat rock and looked at all of it for a long time. She thought about this woman she'd been 10 years ago. 24, exhausted, with flour in her hair and a bank letter in her apron pocket and a debt she couldn't calculate her way out of. That woman had been so certain that survival was the ceiling, that getting through was the ambition, that keeping the ovens lit was the whole definition of success. She'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that she couldn't see anything past it. What she understood now, sitting on the ridge in the October light, was that the crisis had also been the opening. Not because hard times build character. That was the kind of simple thing people said to make difficulty feel meaningful, and difficulty didn't automatically build anything. Some people came through hard times and stayed hard. Some went through them and broke. What the crisis had given her was not wisdom or resilience as general qualities, but a specific concrete thing. It had stripped away every option except the one that was actually hers. She hadn't had the luxury of a wrong direction. She'd had to go straight into the thing she was capable of and do it as well as she possibly could. And then a door had opened, which she hadn't expected, and she'd had the presence of mind or the desperation, or maybe those were the same thing at certain moments, to not let it close. She heard footsteps behind her on the ridge and knew without looking that it was Rhett. He sat down on the rock beside her, closer than the first time they'd sat here, their shoulders touching without either of them arranging for it. "You've been up here a while," he said, thinking. "About what?" She considered. "About that December morning, the first time you came in." He was quiet for a moment. "Before sunrise. You bought every loaf I had." "I needed bread," he said, with perfect straightness. She looked at him. "You came back 3 days later. I still needed bread." Rhett. He was smiling, the full version. "I came back because I wanted to see if you were real," he said. People who work that hard, that early, alone. Sometimes it's desperation, and they fold when the desperation passes. "I wanted to see if you were still standing when it got a little easier." "And?" "You were still standing." He looked out at the valley. "You were standing harder." She leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her without making a moment of it, just a thing that happened, natural as anything. Below them the ranch sat in the fall light, solid and real. And the mountains held their early snow, and Durango's rooftops were visible to the west. The town grown considerably in 10 years, busier and louder and more itself. The original Whitlock's bakery was down there on Main Street, with Polly inside it, with the third oven that Clara had bought with Prescott's deposit, with the 11-year starter, 20-year starter now, feeding on its Thursday schedule in the same ceramic crock her father had used. Some things ended, some things kept going. "George asked me this morning if he could start helping with the fall tally," Rhett said. "He's 12. He's 12 and he understands numbers." A pause. "He gets that from you. He gets the people part from you. He gets the stubbornness from both of us, which is going to be a problem when he's 20. Clara laughed. The valley went a shade deeper in the fading light. There was a thing she'd tried to explain once to Polly when Polly was going through a bad season. A supplier problem, a difficult employee, the specific accumulated weight of a stretch when nothing was going smoothly. Polly had asked how you kept going when the keeping going didn't seem to be leading anywhere visible. Clara had thought about it for a while before answering, because she didn't want to say something that was technically true but practically useless, the kind of encouragement that sounds right and doesn't help. What she'd said was this: "You don't look for the destination. You look for the next thing that's actually yours to do. Not the thing you wish you could do, not the thing that would solve everything at once. The next real, available, specific thing. And you do that thing as well as you can. And then you find the next one. The distance between where you are and where you're trying to get is too large to hold in your head without it crushing you. But the distance between where you are and the next thing you can do, that's workable. That's a size a person can manage. And somewhere in the accumulation of those specific things, done as well as you could do them, a life gets built. Not the life you planned, usually. Not the one you'd have chosen if someone had offered you a list. But a real one, with real weight to it, that's actually yours. The starter had to be fed on a schedule. The oven had to be lit before the sun came up. The dough had to be tended at every stage or it went wrong. And if you did those things, the bread came. And if the bread came, you had something to offer. And if you had something to offer, doors opened that you hadn't known were there. Clara looked out at the valley going dark in the October dusk, at the ranch lights coming on one by one below, at the mountains holding their ancient, indifferent snow. And she thought, This is the life that was in that single loaf on that December morning, coiled up inside it like everything that comes from a good start, waiting for someone to open the door. She was glad she'd opened the door. She was glad every day that she'd opened the door. Rhett's arm was around her shoulders, and the wind came off the mountain with its first edge of real winter in it, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't anything that needed saying. Some things you don't narrate. You just sit inside them and know what they are. Eventually, they walked back down the ridge together toward the lights.